The heavy atmosphere pressed down on the hall of Harvard's Sanders Theater, where 200 students sat in tense silence. At the front, everyone could feel the charged energy between the notorious Professor Charles Whittaker and the only black student in the first row, Marcus Johnson. Professor Whittaker was known for his icy glare and a reputation that went far beyond the physics department. Nobody crossed him without careful thought. Even before he'd spoken, everyone in the room could sense that some kind of showdown was brewing, the kind that rumors cling to for years. The question, shot out like an accusation, felt like a slap echoing through the massive hall. "What exactly do you think you're doing in my class?" There was no mistaking the message. These seats were not for intruders or anyone considered an exception to carefully guarded traditions. Whittaker's words sounded sharp, cutting right to the heart of an old code that only a select few belonged there, and the rest were just passing through undeserving guests. The silence that followed was thick, and even those sitting in the back row barely breathed, not wanting to draw attention. Every set of eyes snapped to Marcus, as if searching for some sign that he would falter or look away in embarrassment. Maybe a flash of fear or awkwardness at being singled out. But Marcus didn't give them that. He still sat tall, his shoulders relaxed, eyes steady, meeting Whittaker's with the same calm you might bring to a difficult but necessary conversation. If anyone expected him to shrink into his seat, they were disappointed. There was a quiet strength in the way Marcus held himself, his dignity shining through so clearly that a few students sitting nearby even straightened up, as if reminded to check their own posture. In that moment, Marcus wasn't just dealing with a single professor's challenge. He could feel the weight of something much bigger, not just the hostility thrown his way, but an entire system stretched out behind. Whittaker, a place where exclusion wore the mask of merit and achievement. Marcus knew deep in his bones that every choice he made from here on out mattered, that he wasn't just standing up for himself, but for everyone who'd been taught to believe there was no place for them in rooms like this. Without hesitating, Marcus replied in a steady voice that he was there to learn, just like anyone else in the room. There was not a single hint of anger or nervousness in his tone, but a quiet confidence that caught everyone off guard. Some students exchanged glances, surprised that he could keep his composure when most people would have been rattled by Whittaker's public challenge. It was like Marcus had seen this before and decided not to let it shake him. His words hung in the air, simple and firm, making it clear that for him there was nothing more natural than being there. Professor Whittaker, still frowning, let out a small scoff, one loud enough for the whole hall to hear. He said, "Learning is one thing, but this program doesn't exist because of quotas or special arrangements. This is Harvard. Seats aren't handed out for free, and no one gets a shortcut, no matter what the world out there says. Advanced physics at this institution is a privilege, not a right." The implication was strong enough to sting. Whittaker glanced around, making sure his point hit home with everyone, as if daring anyone to disagree. He wanted the room to remember that tradition and status were gatekeepers here, and he was holding the keys. A ripple of whispers circled the room, growing as students leaned into each other, trying to make sense of the confrontation unfolding. Just a few feet from them, some looked uncomfortable, unsure where to land in the conversation. Others seemed fascinated, almost entertained by the drama. You could hear muffled sentences and bits of nervous laughter, every reaction thick with the knowledge that this was about more than just Marcus. It was about all the invisible lines built into the world they were part of. At the front of the room, Whittaker seemed to get energy from the attention. For just a moment, the professor almost appeared to forget Marcus as a person and focus on him as a symbol. He started to talk about standards, about how the strength of the university depended on keeping those standards high, as if opening the doors let mediocrity slip in. The whole time, Marcus remained calm, listening carefully. He recognized that Whitaker was not just challenging him. He was using this moment to send a message to the rest of the class about who belonged and who never should have been given the chance. Eager to remind everyone who set the rules in that classroom, Professor Whitaker suddenly decided to turn the situation into a challenge. With a sharp gesture, he picked up a piece of chalk and called Marcus to the board, pointing at a set of equations already scrawled across nearly every inch of it. These formulas, filled with higher-level calculus and theoretical physics, looked like pure gibberish to most students in the hall. Even those who prided themselves on their math skills fidgeted in their seats, relieved not to be in Marcus's shoes. But Marcus didn't hesitate. He stood and made his way down the aisle, his steps steady, not dragging or rushing. Whitaker, standing just a little to the side, almost smirked as he explained the problem. "Let's see if you can show us what you know. Find the eigenvalues of this matrix and use them to describe the quantum system's time evolution in this scenario." The professor was practically daring Marcus to fail in front of everyone. He wanted this to be more than a lesson. He wanted it to be a show, a reminder that he had the power to test, judge, and embarrass anyone he wished. All eyes locked on Marcus as he studied the board for a few moments. A hush took over the lecture hall, with each second feeling stretched as the clock on the back wall ticked louder with each beat. There was a strange, shared tension in the room. The other students barely breathed, unsure if they should be rooting for Marcus or expecting him to stumble. Some wondered quietly to themselves who this guy really was. Where had he come from? What kind of past had shaped someone able to sit through humiliation and still look determined? Most had never seen or heard of Marcus before this class. Yet, suddenly, he was the center of everything. Marcus picked up the chalk and started writing, his handwriting calm and straightforward as he arranged his thoughts. You could see that he wasn't rushing, but he wasn't moving slow either. There was a kind of quiet determination in the way he worked, no need for dramatic pauses or unnecessary words. Bit by bit, a path to the answer started to take shape. In the mess of formulas, instead of shrinking from the impossible, Marcus showed that he'd faced hard problems before, probably in places far removed from the spotlight of Harvard's hallowed lecture halls. As Marcus reached the board, flashes of his childhood back in Detroit came rushing through his mind. He remembered nights spent hunched over a battered kitchen table, only a worn-out candle for light because the electricity had been cut off again. He could picture his mother in the next room, humming softly while worrying about how to stretch. $20 for groceries through the rest of the week. Marcus remembered scavenging for old textbooks at the library's used book sale, finding ones that other students discarded because they were a little torn or scribbled in. Those books became his treasures, each one covered in his careful notes and highlighted passages. He also could not forget the voices of kids on his street, sometimes laughing or shaking their heads when they'd see him carrying a stack of books on his way home. "Man, nobody from here is going to end up at Harvard," they'd tease, never letting him forget that aiming too high was dangerous. Teachers sometimes seemed surprised by his questions. Some encouraged him, but others just smiled politely, certain that boys like Marcus would always hit a wall before they got too far. But now, standing at the board with all those stares fixed on him, those memories didn't bring fear or shame. Instead, something like peace washed over him. It was strange, but the pressure and expectation in Professor Whitaker's class somehow felt familiar. Marcus realized that every rough night, every joke at his expense, even every setback had taught him how to focus and keep his head straight right when others would freeze or panic. Harvard's imposing lecture halls and tough problems were just the latest in a long line of barriers he'd faced. He let himself settle into that old feeling of quiet on the inside, shutting out the whispers and the weight of everyone's eyes. His hand didn't shake as he reached for the chalk. He thought of how far he'd come, not just in miles, but in all those moments no one else saw when he decided to keep going. With each line he wrote, Marcus reminded himself that everything up to now had prepared him for situations like this. Maybe he wasn't from the places everyone expected, but he was exactly where he needed to be, right now, and he was ready to prove it, mostly to himself, more than to anyone else. Marcus stared at the equations for a moment longer, then turned toward Professor Whitaker and, in a calm voice that cut straight through the silence, asked, "Can I use the Whitaker grant approach here?" That question landed in the room like a dropped book. For a full second, even Whitaker seemed off guard. He hesitated, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. Hardly anybody in the hall would have recognized that method by name. The Whitaker grant approach was a niche technique, rarely taught and mostly discussed in advanced seminars or hidden in long academic papers that few undergraduates ever bothered to dig up. Marcus knew this, and clearly Whitaker hadn't expected it. The students, meanwhile, weren't sure how to react. Some glanced at each other, eyebrows raised, quietly mouthing the words to themselves, as if trying to remember where they had heard them. A couple of them started searching on their laptops, hoping to figure out what Marcus was talking about before anyone else did. The professors in the back row exchanged quick looks, surprised that someone not only knew about the method, but was bold enough to mention it in front of its namesake. For a beat, the normal rules in the room felt flipped. The expert lost. A bit of his armor, and the so-called outsider's voice suddenly took on a new weight. Whitaker finally nodded, lips pressed together as he tried to recover his usual composure. "Go ahead, if you think you can." That answer came out flatter than usual, missing some of the confidence he'd shown earlier. For the first time all semester, it was obvious to everyone that Professor Whitaker's intellectual grip on the room was not absolute. There was a visible shift, not just in him, but in how the students saw Marcus. People realized, maybe for the first time, that the kid at the front wasn't just surviving the test, but changing the whole dynamic of who could control the flow of learning in that lecture hall. Marcus didn't gloat or slow down. He simply turned back to the board, poised and focused. Each step followed the method precisely, breaking down the equation in a way that felt both familiar to some and completely new to most. The supposed secrets of advanced physics, usually kept behind closed doors, started to seem like tools anyone determined could learn to use. And just by asking the right question out loud, Marcus managed to make that old wall of unspoken rules look a little thinner than before. As Marcus kept writing, his hand moved smoothly, almost without pause. Each chalk mark seemed to flow out naturally, as if he were telling a story the board had been waiting to hear. The room, packed with nearly 200 people, fell into a hush. Outside, the faint sounds of Harvard Yard drifted through the old windows, but inside it was as if time paused. No one dared to shift in their seat or tap on a laptop. All eyes stayed glued to the board, watching Marcus take apart complex calculations and stitch them back together using the Whitaker grant approach. At one point, Emma Barnes, the graduate research fellow and Professor Whitaker's longtime teaching assistant, leaned forward. She had sat through years of these lectures and graded countless problem sets, but she knew instantly that something special was going on. Marcus was not just solving the problem. He was doing it with a kind of boldness that you rarely saw. He went after the hardest parts directly, not hiding behind standard tricks or safe moves. Emma picked up on details most students, and even some postdocs, would never notice. It was clear he had a deep understanding that came from true curiosity, not just memorizing steps. Wordlessly, the mood in the theater started shifting. What began as tension and skepticism slowly softened into a quiet surge of respect. Even the students who were most doubtful when Marcus first stood up now found themselves re-evaluating everything. They watched as he showed his work, step by step, sometimes pausing to double-check himself, but never getting stuck. He drew connections and pointed out shortcuts as he went, changing a mess of tangled formulas into something almost elegant. There was no applause or outburst, but you could feel the admiration growing with every new symbol and each line that seemed to fit perfectly in place. The lecture hall's silence was different now, not heavy or cold, but charged with focused awe. Marcus was not just answering a question, he was showing everyone what could happen when you bring together effort, talent, and a willingness to push past what others think is possible. By the time he finished, even the skeptics in the room had to admit, silently or not, that they were witnessing something rare and real. For the first time since the class began, the silence in Sanders Theatre was filled with fascination rather than fear. After nearly 20 minutes at the board, Marcus drew a box around his final answer, set the chalk down, and stepped back. For a heartbeat, nobody quite believed what they were seeing. The room was so quiet you could probably hear footsteps all the way outside the old wooden doors. He had done it, walked through each step, reaching a solution that honestly, most people in that room were not sure was even possible. Professor Whitaker swallowed hard and walked up for a closer look. He scanned the chalkboard from one end to the other, taking in Marcus's work. His eyes tracked each line, looking for any excuse, any little mistake he could point out. Whitaker managed to keep his face mostly blank, but those close by could see his jaw clenching as he weighed his next move. After a few seconds, he cleared his throat, still trying to hold on to his authority, and said, "This problem might have been familiar to you. It's possible you just memorized. This one example. After all, these things sometimes circulate in student circles." He said it in a way that almost sounded reasonable, as if he were teaching a lesson about academic honesty instead of protecting his own place at the top. But Marcus just nodded, letting the words hang in the air without reacting. Then, in the same calm tone from before, he added, "Actually, Professor, if you look at this step," he pointed to a line just above the midpoint. "I made a change here based on an approach I read about in a paper you published about 6 years ago. But your paper took a longer path, and I figured out a shortcut by adapting one of your references to account for a different boundary condition. I can walk through it if you'd like." With each word, it became obvious to even the most skeptical that Marcus was not just copying things from memory. He had understood, adapted, and taken the work even further. You could feel a shift in the space around them. Every person there sensed that the real balance of knowledge and influence had changed. Few spoke up, but it was clear on their faces. Respect, surprise, even admiration for someone they hadn't really noticed before. For one brief moment, all the old rules and expectations faded. The student who had started the class as an outsider had just redrawn the lines, right there in the front of Sanders Theatre. As students filtered out into the crisp Cambridge afternoon, Marcus tried to blend in with the crowd, keeping his head down and backpack slung over one shoulder. But before he made it down the steps, Emma Barnes caught up with him. She bent low to collect a scattered stack of handouts she had just happened to drop in his path. In a quiet voice meant only for Marcus, she whispered, "Whitaker is going to come after you. Be at the library at 7. Bring a flash drive." She barely looked at him as she gathered her papers, making the whole exchange seem like nothing but a typical rush at the end of class. That was the moment Marcus realized he was not completely alone, not anymore. He had come in as an outsider, and now, with Emma's warning, he saw cracks forming in the old barriers. It was not exactly friendship, at least not yet, but the divide between students and the people in academic power began to blur. With just a few words, she showed him that even in a place built on tradition and status, some were willing to cross the line when it mattered. Meanwhile, back upstairs in Professor Whitaker's dim, oak-panelled office, the conflict raged on. Whitaker wasted no time summoning Marcus to his private space, and now that the lecture hall audience was gone, he dropped all pretense of encouragement. The air was heavy, colder than ever, as the professor sat behind his desk, a fortress of leather-bound books and framed degrees. He slid a thick folder across the polished surface and accused Marcus, straight out, of academic dishonesty. No one solves those problems without prior knowledge, and I have seen this kind of trick before, Whitaker said, voice clipped and sharp. People like you learn to game the system, but it never lasts. He declared that Marcus would now have to complete a series of nearly impossible assignments, each one more challenging than the last. Whitaker listed them out, almost daring Marcus to protest. His message clear: succeed or quietly vanish from Harvard, like so many others who never quite fit in. Marcus listened, calm but alert, mentally filing away every word. He knew the rules of this silent battle had changed, and he would have to call on every lesson learned back in Detroit, and now every new ally at Harvard, to stand a chance against a system built to keep people like him out. That evening, back in his small apartment in Somerville, Marcus prepared for what would come next. The apartment was a far cry from the shiny dorms some of his classmates called home. There was not much furniture. A futon, a rickety table, a few chairs one of his neighbors had left by the curb. But Marcus hardly noticed. Any extra space was filled with stacks of journals, textbooks with battered spines, and manila folders crammed with handwritten notes. He kept his most important research hidden carefully behind some loose floorboards, tucked away with letters from Harvard he had received over the years, many of them rejections, some for scholarships, others just cold acknowledgments. The sting from those letters still lingered, but in a way they fueled him. Each time he read over them, they reminded him of all the obstacles he had beaten with nothing but grit and late-night work. He sat at the table and reread each rejection, letting the old doubts surface one last time. Before pushing them back down, he looked around at what he had managed to build on his own, every goal checked off, every win that came not from luck or connections, but from a steady grind when everyone else had written him off. With each document, Marcus convinced himself more. He deserved to be at Harvard as much as anyone else, if not more. He powered up his second-hand laptop, its keyboard faded, and E-key a little loose. With careful words, he typed out an email to the Department of Physics. He explained his eligibility for the Expanded Access Program, laying out not only his achievements, but the ways he had fulfilled every possible requirement on his own. He was formal and direct, knowing how easily requests like this could be swept aside without clear evidence. I am requesting immediate acceptance into the department under the Expanded Access track, as outlined by the university's own policies, he wrote, attaching documents and carefully scanned pages as proof. Before hitting send, he double-checked every line. Marcus knew this would put the department and Professor Whitaker under a different kind of pressure. By moving the fight into the open, he made it impossible for hidden threats or backroom politics to decide his fate. All that was left was to press send, then sit back and wait for the first spark of change to catch. That night, with just a few minutes to spare before 7, Marcus slipped into Widener Library, his collar turned up against the early spring chill. The building's high, echoing halls were almost empty, and he made his way quietly past rows of old portraits and into a far corner marked Private Study. Emma was already there, her backpack on the table, laptop open. She glanced up when he arrived, her look serious. Without wasting time, Emma passed Marcus a small flash drive and started speaking in a low voice. "You need to know what you're up against," she said, glancing around to make sure no one was in earshot. "Whitaker's reach goes a lot further than you think. Over the past few years, he's covered up plagiarism charges, took credit for his students' work, and even had colleagues quietly moved out when they got too close to the truth. Most of the international students who complained, their visas ended up mistakenly revoked after one semester. No one talks about any of it because Whitaker's name carries too much weight at Harvard. People want to keep their jobs, their funding. They don't want to mess with someone that powerful. Marcus listened, anger simmering just below his calm. Emma clicked a few keys, then slid evidence across the screen. Emails, marked up drafts, transcripts of conversations. He's about to release a new paper, the one he previewed last week. But it's not his. He stole the main results from someone in a lab in California, rushed the rest, and covered up some major errors in the calculations. I only know because I graded some of the early drafts and noticed things that didn't make sense. He ignored my notes. And now, if this thing goes out as planned, it's going to cement his reputation even more, and trash anyone who tries to contest it. Marcus stared at the text, letting it all sink in. This was no longer about just his spot in the program, or even about the unfair tests and assignments. The weight of it landed on him. What happened next might decide the future for other students, the ones who came hoping for a fair chance. If he backed down, the silence would only grow. If he stepped up, it would mean taking on a system much bigger than just one professor's ego. He took a slow breath and said, "Let's make sure the right people see this before it's too late." The next few days felt like a blur for Marcus. He moved from class to class, quietly sitting through lectures and taking notes. But his mind was always half somewhere else. When he was not in the science building or busy with lab work, he could be found tucked away in a corner of the library. While he started writing the essay Professor Whitaker had demanded, an in-depth piece on quantum entanglement, his real focus was on the information Emma had handed him. There was a kind of energy pushing him forward. This was not just about beating one assignment anymore. He was building a case that might make things fairer for everyone who always felt left out or ignored. His approach was methodical, almost like he was working on a big physics proof. Each night, Marcus spread the evidence Emma supplied across his desk, emails showing cut-and-paste passages from student work to Whitaker's papers, peer review comments that got buried, and dates that did not line up. He sorted everything into neat folders, backing it up on his flash drive, and even hiding a copy behind those old floorboards, just in case. Sometimes he caught himself barely blinking at the screen for long stretches, realizing how deep this thing went. It was not just one or two mistakes. He was seeing patterns of favoritism, pressures to stay silent, and a web of intimidation that kept people from speaking up. Bringing it all together took a different kind of skill. He drafted a report that explained the situation as if he were proving a scientific theory, with careful references and clear, step-by-step logic that could not easily be dismissed. He highlighted the gaps in Whitaker's latest paper, not only showing where the plagiarism occurred, but pointing out the mathematical flaws that had somehow slipped past everyone else. It was a strong case, one that Marcus hoped could not be brushed off with excuses or threats, but it was not just about catching a cheater. As he filled in his notes, Marcus realized the stakes were bigger than any single article or grade. He talked with Emma nearly every day, the two of them planning who else to trust or how to share the evidence so it could not be buried. The more he learned, the more certain he became. This was a fight for people who worked hard but never got a fair shot. The structure that lifted a few by keeping most people invisible had to change. Marcus felt the weight of it, but for the first time he also felt like he could do something real. While Professor Whitaker kept a close eye on Marcus, almost convinced he was chasing after a troublemaker set up by colleagues who wanted to see him fall, Marcus moved with a quiet confidence. He did not let Whitaker's surveillance shake him. Instead, Marcus started shaping a plan that went far beyond surviving a tough semester or clearing his own name. He knew deep down that the real win would be to shift the balance for good. Not just patch things for himself, but help others who would come after. There was another side to Marcus's life that even Emma did not know much about. Twice a week, after his classes and late-night research in the library, Marcus hopped the Red Line out toward Dorchester, a part of the city that rarely saw anyone from Harvard's ranks. There, in the basement of a local community center, he quietly ran a physics class for teens who had never been within shouting distance of Harvard Yard. These were determined kids, bright and full of questions, but most of them were juggling after-school jobs, taking care of siblings, or just trying to dodge the trouble that came from having too few good options. The chalkboard here was cracked and half the desks wobbled, but Marcus had never seen a group so eager to learn. He worked through basic ideas, momentum, energy, sometimes even sneaking in stories about recent discoveries. But his larger goal was to show these students that ideas belonged to everyone, not just those who could afford fancy private tutors or prep schools. Over time, more students showed up, often bringing younger brothers or cousins along for the ride. Marcus did his best not to draw attention for the group's safety, keeping their sessions off any official lists or social media. The energy he got from those evenings was different from anything he felt on campus. For these teens, every small understanding was a win. When someone managed to solve a tough problem, the whole group seemed to get just a bit brighter. In that crowded basement room, Marcus saw a future built on opportunity instead of barriers. Even when the days at Harvard were heavy or when Whitaker's shadow felt too big, these teaching nights kept him steady. With every passing week, Marcus was staking out something important, not just for his own fight against unfairness at Harvard, but for a wider group that had never been allowed to dream that big. Step by step, he was planting seeds where hope had almost disappeared. By Thursday morning, Marcus felt the nerves creep in, but he refused to let them control him. He printed out his research essay, watching as page after page slid off the old campus printer until there were 25 in the stack, more than double the assigned length. The essay was not long just for the sake of it. Every section dealt with the core topic, but Marcus had gone beyond, bringing in original data, analysis, and constructive challenges to points in the existing literature. He could not help but feel a bit of pride as he clipped it all together, thinking about the late nights, the cross-checking of sources, and those moments of doubt that he had pushed through. Later, when Marcus walked into Whitaker's office, he could sense the usual chill. Whitaker was perched behind his polished desk, looking over the top of his glasses with skepticism. Marcus placed the thick essay squarely in the center of the desk, and for a second, the room felt even quieter. Whitaker picked up the stack, flipping quickly through the pages, his eyebrows climbing higher as he saw just how comprehensive it was. "You know the requirement was 10 pages, Whitaker said, voice tight and dismissive, "but I guess you could not help yourself." His tone made it clear he thought Marcus was showing off, maybe even trying too hard to stand out. "This doesn't mean you belong here. You need to understand that. There is a difference between being clever and being part of this place." Marcus felt the sting but did not let it sink in too deep. He stood his ground, his response calm. "I felt the topic deserved more, and for what it is worth, I think the real difference comes from work and proof, not just tradition." Before Whitaker could respond, Marcus slid a sealed envelope across the desk. "By the way, I wanted to let you know that there is going to be an administrative review of my standing tomorrow. I have submitted my case to the committee, including supporting evidence, and the outcome no longer depends on anyone. A person." He watched as Whitaker's face tightened, the professor realizing that things were shifting out of his control. Marcus was no longer just a student hoping for a good grade. He was someone whose future would be decided on clear merit, not a private judgment. For the first time, Marcus felt the ground starting to even out beneath him, and he left the office, with his head held high. That night, a quiet tension spread over Cambridge. In two different corners of the city, lights glowed long after most windows had gone dark. In an office lined with shelves and polished wood, Professor Whitaker kept pacing. He had set out stacks of his own articles, marking them up again and again, searching for anything he might have missed, a statistic, a footnote, or some piece of evidence that would protect him if questions were asked. He was restless and, for once, not as confident as usual. His name had always commanded respect, but now it felt less solid, like the ground might be shifting under him. Each time he tried to focus, his eyes kept drifting back to the envelope Marcus had left, the one that spelled out the growing threat to the quiet grip he held over the department. Across town, in his modest apartment, Marcus was in motion too, but with a kind of purpose that felt new. Papers were spread all over the kitchen table and couch, laptops hummed, tabs open to emails, policy documents, and copies of the plagiarized work that had started everything. Marcus made notes, arranged timelines, and double-checked every point, determined to make his case impossible to ignore. He rehearsed how he would present his findings to the review committee, knowing there would be questions, maybe even pushback, but also that this time he was ready. He was not just standing up for himself, he was fighting for everyone who had ever felt boxed out or pushed aside. Outside, a steady spring rain drummed against the windows, but Marcus barely noticed. His focus held steady late into the night, each step forward easing some of the old fear inside him. What used to keep him awake with worry now sharpened his resolve. The more he prepared, the more the feeling grew. The real shift was happening. In the air and behind closed doors. For the first time, the people who had always controlled the room seemed unsure. The fear that had lived in students like Marcus was changing hands, moving to those who had never expected to answer hard questions. As dawn crept closer, both men kept working, the old guard scrambling to defend, the young challenger piecing together truth. The power seemed to hang in the balance, and somewhere in that quiet city, history waited for the next morning. That Friday morning, the committee room at Harvard was buzzing before the sun even finished breaking through the clouds. Folding chairs filled up fast with students leaning forward, anxious to witness what everyone understood would be a turning point. Behind a long table sat 6 professors from different departments, and the dean, their faces serious and a little wary. On one side of the table was Marcus, posture straight but hands folded tightly together in his lap. On the other, Professor Whitaker, who looked both tense and defensive as he stacked and restacked his papers. After the dean welcomed the group and spelled out the purpose of the review, the meeting opened with Whitaker's statement. He cleared his throat, straightened in his seat, and wasted no time going on the offensive. He listed Marcus's lack of awards and competitions, pointed out that he had not attended an elite prep school or won a major science grant as an undergraduate, and even hinted that Marcus's background was too unorthodox for someone in such a competitive program. He kept his tone formal, but it had an edge. In the past, these attacks might have been enough to sway some of the professors, who were used to measuring potential in medals and distant references rather than grit and original thought. But the mood in the room had shifted. Professors exchanged glances, and even the dean's expression showed a trace of impatience. They had heard these lines before, and it was clear that old formulas were no longer enough. People in the audience, some of them international students, or those who knew what it was like to stay on the sidelines, had come to see if something real would finally break through the surface. Marcus listened without flinching, letting Whitaker run down his list until he ran out of steam. Then, with a measured breath, Marcus switched on the small projector he had brought and started laying out his case. He presented the side-by-side passages showing clear plagiarism, displayed the mismatched dates and faked peer reviews, and explained how the errors in Whitaker's new paper would have misled the entire field if left unchallenged. He was careful, clear, and referenced sources, so every claim could be checked. People in the room leaned in, eyes shifting from Marcus to Whitaker. For the first time, the balance of credibility had started to move, and this time, it was not just about whose resume looked better. Marcus continued with a steady hand, showing each piece of evidence without rushing or raising his voice. After his opening, he clicked to the first document on the projector, a copy of his own essay, which external reviewers had praised for its originality, clarity, and depth. He pointed out the comments from outside professors, people with no personal stake in the outcome, who had highlighted parts of his paper as especially thoughtful and innovative. Their words carried weight, and Marcus let them speak for themselves on the screen, moving slowly so everyone could read. Then he turned to the real heart of his case. Marcus showed the committee how entire sections from his essay had been copied into Professor Whitaker's upcoming article, line for line, idea for idea. He placed the passages side by side, using bright highlights so no one could mistake the similarities. There was no complicated jargon, just one clear example after another. He explained how the submission dates proved his work had come first and walked them through emails and drafts that backed up his timeline. All the while, Whitaker stared ahead, his face drawn and pale. One of the professors started paging through the printed packets, comparing what he saw on screen to the documents in front of him. The other professors followed, some frowning, others just quietly stunned. The air in the room thickened as the evidence piled up, and even the dean had to pause before clearing his throat quietly. The only noise was the occasional shift of a chair or the soft tapping of fingers flipping through pages. Even the crowd tucked in the back stayed still. Whitaker tried to break the silence, insisting that any overlap was accidental or that Marcus was exaggerating the case. But his voice had lost its sure edge, and the committee did not jump to follow his lead. All it took was a few direct, steady words from Marcus. He simply summarized what the evidence showed, asked the professors to look again, and pointed to the facts. He did not belittle or accuse. He just made it impossible to ignore what was in front of them. It became clear as sunlight breaking through the clouds that the old rules did not hold up anymore. People were ready to listen, and with every passing minute, the old hierarchy that once seemed unshakable looked smaller and more fragile. Just when it seemed the worst damage to Whitaker's reputation had already been done, Emma, who had been silently listening in her place at the committee table, finally spoke up. Until that moment, she had kept her hands folded and her eyes low, not wanting to draw attention. But the truth had been building up inside her for months. Emma waited until the room's attention had shifted from Marcus to the questioning professors, then cleared her throat and began to speak with quiet but unmistakable determination. She explained that she had seen patterns in the past, cases where promising students from outside the usual prep school pipeline struggled, not only because of the academic challenges, but because their work was sometimes taken or minimized without credit. Emma gave several concrete examples of projects she had mentored, pointing out similarities in how credits and discoveries seemed to change hands, almost always in favor of someone already at the top. She made it clear that Marcus was not a one-time outlier, but the latest in a string of young researchers who faced these setbacks. Emma's voice grew firmer as she described the resilience Marcus had shown, insisting that his ability to keep pushing forward instead of giving up was every bit as important as any single breakthrough. The room sat heavy with her words. For the first time, the illusion that Harvard's prestige guaranteed fairness began to crumble right in front of the faculty's eyes. People glanced at each other, some clearly uncomfortable, others quietly relieved that these things were being said out loud at last. Then, as if on cue, a few graduate students handed over small flash drives to the committee members. On each one were recorded statements and emails from international students who could not be there in person, but still wanted their voices heard. Some told how their research had been brushed aside, or their ideas subtly co-opted for publications they never got to sign. Others described the slow, heavy feeling of being considered outsiders, even after months or years of hard work. As each testimony played out on the big screen, it became harder and harder for anyone to pretend that Marcus's story was just a single misunderstanding. What looked isolated at first now appeared unmistakably as a pattern, a web of exclusion and hidden plagiarism that had been quietly tolerated for much too long. The committee room, so often a place of rigid order, now seemed ready for something honest and new. The committee did not need long to reach a decision. The mountain of proof, the lived experiences shared in those video clips, and Emma's steady testimony had left no space for old habits to survive. Quietly, the dean leaned forward and read the verdict in a clear, level voice. Harvard would be opening a formal investigation into Professor Whitaker's actions. At the same time, Marcus's place in the program would be fully confirmed. Not only would he stay, he would receive a full scholarship and support for his research, moving forward without the fear of his work being dismissed or stolen. The announcement rippled across the room, sending up a wave of whispers and even a few gasps. Some students reached for their phones, no doubt imagining headlines and messages home about what had just unfolded. The professors who had once turned away from these kinds of disputes now looked straight at Marcus, some with shame, others with cautious encouragement, as if recognizing for the first time how things might start to change. Security was called quietly, and Professor Whitaker, now stripped of his position and prestige, was escorted out of the committee room. No one stood up. No applause followed. He left with only the faintest click of the door behind him. What had begun as an unshakable reign ended in minutes, with all the old titles and privileges fading away in the hush of collective judgment. As the news settled, a few students began to clap, soft at first, then gradually building into a stronger round of applause. Marcus did not start the celebration, but he accepted it with the calm dignity he had carried all along. He looked from face to face, not with gloating or triumph, but with the steady understanding that this victory was about more than just himself. He realized he was now a symbol for every student who had questioned whether they belonged, every researcher from a small town or far-off country who worried their work would never be enough. In that moment, Marcus became more than the sum of his achievements. He became a sign that change could actually happen at Harvard, and that maybe the next generation could build something fairer. The room, once thick with tension, now felt open, as if a long-closed window had finally been raised. Several months later, Harvard's largest lecture hall filled to capacity once again. This time, however, it was not for a tense committee hearing or an internal struggle, but for something brighter, a celebration marking a new beginning. Marcus, now officially the youngest assistant professor in the university's long-storied history, was about to give his inaugural lecture. The event had drawn people from every part of campus and the community, but it was especially significant for those who had often felt invisible in those old, echoing halls. Rows of students who had come from other states, students who spoke English with an accent, those whose parents had never gone to college, and international scholars crowded into the seats. There was a real buzz of excitement, a kind of cautious hope that maybe things really were shifting. Among all these faces was someone particularly important to Marcus, his mother, sitting proudly near the front. She wore a simple blue scarf and watched her son with a quiet glow. knowing what this day meant not just for him, but for every person in their family who had dreamed from afar. Marcus took a moment before he spoke. He looked out across the audience, caught his mother's eye, and smiled just a little. Then he began, not with lofty theories, but with a story about his first day at Harvard, the fear, the small triumphs, and all the doubts that almost pushed him away. His honesty brought nods and quiet laughter from the crowd, and it was clear. He meant to use his new position not as a platform for bragging, but as an open door. Meanwhile, the impact of what had happened months before kept spreading. The investigation, set off by Marcus's courage and the testimonies of so many students, had revealed even more about the deep-rooted ways some faculty had protected their own interests. Over the following months, several more professors quietly resigned after findings confirmed patterns of bias and gatekeeping. New committees were formed to rebuild trust, revise the way opportunities were handed out, and make sure ideas came first, not connections or legacy. That day's lecture felt like both an ending and a fresh start. Students and faculty left the hall talking in small groups, energized by what had seemed impossible only a year ago. The walls that had felt so solid for so long had finally started to shift, leaving wide, sunlit spaces for those willing to work and dream together. Over time, Marcus took on a role that went far beyond his new title at Harvard. He became the driving force behind a network that connected high school and college students from working-class neighborhoods all over the United States, with established research groups and professors at top universities. With each video call and message, board post, Marcus helped break down the invisible walls that had kept so many talented students out of the conversation for so long. He set up tutoring sessions that matched first-generation college hopefuls with current graduate students, invited neighborhood science clubs to tour Harvard labs, and even organized community science festivals in places that had never seen a professor before. It was not only the curriculum that changed, it was the idea of who belonged in places of so-called excellence. Marcus's main research article, focused on opening up scientific knowledge to everyone, made waves both across campus and far outside it. Schools in other cities shared it with their teachers. Community groups running after-school programs invited him to speak, and young people who had never thought of college as a real possibility started showing up in his office hours, sometimes just to ask questions or swap stories. Faculty at other universities started calling, asking Marcus how they might start similar outreach in their own institutions. His days grew long, often packed with meetings, workshops, and conversations with students who were hungry for guidance. But it was not the hours he remembered at the end of each week. It was the sense of purpose. Marcus often walked out of the university library in the evenings, surrounded by students who, just a couple of years before, had never dreamed of making it to Harvard. Now, they left his office full of ideas and determination, eager to create more options for the people who would follow after them. One night, as he locked up the classroom after a late mentoring session, Marcus paused by his desk. Letters of rejection and encouraging reminders mixed together in his top drawer, a living record of both struggle and resilience. It struck him then that real victory did not mean just claiming a seat at the table, it meant opening paths for everyone else. The game had changed, and his legacy was not power or prestige, but possibility. Marcus had shown his students and himself that the future was something built together, one open door at a time.